back to Chopin. Okay. So Robert is in a really bad situation. He doesn't actually want to be with Edna. He's basically just being a young rake jackass, right? And so when she finally is like, we can be together, he's like, so he disappears. Now, this leads us to our ending. Now, before I get to the ending, let me first take a moment to talk about the way Edna treats her children. And this was a very striking thing for me as a student, because, when I was in college, I, believe it or not, had some pretty conservative ideas on how families and gender politics were supposed to play out. And Chopin torpedoes a lot of that really, really thoroughly with this idea. So, what is the role of a woman in Victorian culture, in a very, regulated, tightly policed kind of, society? And keep in mind, a lot of these rules go right out the flipping window when you get out of the high classes. But when we're in the high classes, she's a mother. She's a mother, and she is a socialite. That is the extent of your function. You don't even have to do things like cooking and cleaning or house maintenance that we would think stereotypically applied to females at this time. Because, if anything, the woman becomes a extension of the man's social status. You're supposed to throw parties, and you're supposed to serve crumpets, and you're supposed to look really good as my wife. That's the basic function of this relationship. That's what she's supposed to be. She really hates that crap, right? She doesn't want to be there. So she fails in that regard, because it's very obvious that she doesn't want to be that person. But in some ways, she also has a tendency to fail at being a mother, which it makes it a little bit more difficult to digest this. Edna, and this would be a really good discussion question, I think we'll post that for this week or maybe next. Edna states at one point in the novel, and it's one of those that just really make you raise an eyebrow. She says that she loves her children, and she would die for them, but she will not sacrifice herself. What does that mean? Because the women who are around her at that point are like, it's like, oh my goodness. What does she mean? What she means is she would be okay with physically dying for them. But as far as giving up her personal essence, giving up who she is, that's out of the question. And so her husband eventually leaves. He gets the point. He pushes the issue. And he expects her to come to her senses. Because it's like, woman, you can't do this. This ain't 2000. We're not progressive at all. You cannot do this. Edna becomes a fallen woman. What we call a fallen woman. When if a woman cheats on her man, that ain't good. Now, here's where things take a dark turn, and where we have to start kind of, doing a little bit of conjecture. Her husband eventually just disappears. Leaves her somehow in this weird vacation home. He's gone. He's completely out of the picture. I don't know how she's still located there. Probably because there's really not much that he can really do with her at this point. Divorce was exceedingly rare. Especially when you've been together for a long time and you have 3 friggin' kids. Right? Because if you wanted a divorce back then, what you had to do was kind of finagle your way through it to say that there had been, either the marriage had never been what we call consummated. Usually, I never slept with her, so you could get it annulled. Or that there was some type of technical thing that, the marriage was never official in the first place. That's a hard thing to do. In the 1950s, we had no-fault divorce come by, and a lot of people were really upset about that. But at the same time, you kind of have the ability to just get out of a marriage because you don't want to be there anymore. But in this case, they're kind of stuck together, right? Edna would probably become a fallen woman. She would just be completely cast to the wayside in society. Women at this point had absolutely no way of taking care of themselves financially if their marriage dissolved. The only way that she could inherit the fortune would be if her husband died. So now she's kind of in limbo. She could become a kind of nun, maybe? She could be a beggar. These are the types of things that happens to a fallen woman. One of the things that we see with Stephen Crane, he looks a lot at prostitution. In his book, Maggie Girl of the Streets, probably one of the best stories I've ever read. Maggie Girl of the Streets. She could become a prostitute, right? So Edna's prospects at this point are pretty dark. She's already pretty much kind of like squatting in this house. And it's only going to be a matter of time before her husband's just completely fed up with her, and there's no recourse at this point. Now, and that leads us to the swimming scene. And there's been a lot of debate about this. Edna swims, and she remembers this contest they used to have as kids. Whoever would swim out the farthest would win, but there was always that fear, how far can I go? Will I be able to make it back? Right? And Edna gets into the water, and this is what makes it confusing, is the fact that the water is a welcoming place, right? She's free, and she's swimming out further than she's ever been before. And it ends like that. So what happened? Maybe she came back. I don't know. It doesn't come right out and say what happened. But there's an implication. The implication is that she drowned herself. And it's, it's kind of like, oh no, that's so sad. It kind of is, because I don't know if Chopin necessarily meant that she was supposed to have drowned herself. Rather, it's kind of like she fell off the face of the earth. Because at this point, society did not really have a good language or rhetoric for discussing what would happen with fallen women. And Chopin was writing for a more socialite class, and was writing for, more intellectual sides of things, and that's why her stories are so unbelievably dialogue-driven. Stephen Crane, his stuff is very action-oriented. It's always about things that are physically happening, and we respond to it. There's dialogue, but so much of Chopin is so incredibly mental. So Chopin seems to be wanting more to pose a question, and she leaves us at the end where Edna's like suspended in time, because what do you do with her in a society that has absolutely no conception of this happening? There's another great example of this over in I think it was Denmark. I can never remember this off the top of my head. Henrik Ibsen wrote A Doll's House, and that did the exact same thing, except instead of a book, it was a play. And in A Doll's House, a woman leaves her husband. He's an abusive jerk, and she leaves him and just straight up is like, "I'm leaving. I'm not coming back." And when she leaves, it leaves with the door slamming shut, and that is the last sound. And I like to tell people, when we first read the story, we think it's about a woman leaving her husband. It's a lot more than that. Because at this point in time, we didn't have a conception of a woman being able to leave her husband. So when the protagonist of A Doll's House walks out the door, you have that almost kind of weird implication, like, well, she's gonna die, right? It's almost like a suicide, because we simply have nothing that we can do with her at this point. She's walking into a snowstorm, basically, and where's she gonna go? There's nowhere for you to go. You can't, there's nothing for you to do. You can't earn an income. So Ibsen did the exact same thing. Like, the slamming door, Edna swimming out, woo, I'm going to swim to Mars. All this stuff is kind of making the same point. And what point is it raising? It's doing something quite gutsy. The fact that, there's a problem here we have with the way that we treat women. They're people too. These books and these plays and these stories struggle to show us a woman in realistic terms. To say, yeah, she's miserable. Yeah, she's taking risks, and she's going to throw herself off of the planet, basically, because she wants to be free, and that's the freedom for her to do that. And Chopin can't come out and say these things yet, but she's hinting towards it. And later on, we get more explicit exploration of the role of women in society, but at this point, all we can do is imply and make them disappear off the face of the earth like a bad episode of Unsolved Mysteries. Anybody remember that show? I'm hungry.